Good morning. It is 10:08 a.m. on Sunday, March 1st, 2020. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. So, because it's Sunday, I'm continuing my rewatch of Cowboy Bebop with session 21, 22, session 22, Cowboy Funk. This episode, I have noted that, sometimes when, articles will go around, ranking Cowboy Bebop episodes, this one sometimes gets put on the lower end of the scale, and I see people, sometimes complain about it, and honestly, I wonder, it's always a risk to try to psychoanalyze people's opinions on those sorts of pop culture lists, but I wonder if the reason that some people don't like this episode is because they have fallen into a mindset of kind of hero worshipping Spike. As he's just so cool, he has no faults, he can do no wrong. And therefore, any episode which makes him look a little silly, lampoons him a little bit, they don't enjoy that, maybe? That's just a speculation. For my own part, I think Spike's a very cool character, but he absolutely does have faults, and I think this episode does a really great job at kind of poking fun at that, and it has some silly stuff in it, and gives all of the other characters something to do. It's a filler episode that nonetheless shines some light on character development without ignoring all of the other cast members. Got some good action in it. I like it. So, what happens in this episode? Well, we begin with a terrorist who plants bombs in teddy bears and then leaves them around and detonates them in buildings. And so we see him planning his next strike, only to have Spike show up and doing his cool apprehension of the criminal thing. And the only thing that seems at all off at first is that the guy definitely knows who Spike is like, oh no, Spike Spiegel, you're one of the cowboys that criminals definitely don't want to get caught by. You and Andy. And Spike's like, Andy? Who's that? Who's Andy? And then we find out who Andy is. The heralding with the whistle that So the whistling song is obviously inspired by music from spaghetti westerns, Ennio Morricone. I think I'm saying that right. Ennio Morricone. That's what it was. The good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything. But the idea that those sorts of soundtrack type songs from those spaghetti westerns is literally audible from everybody in the scene is kind of weird but funny. And then a cowboy shows up. We've called bounty hunters cowboys through the whole series, but now this is the classical western cowboy, big hat, riding a horse, carrying a lasso. Shows up inexplicably and is like, oh no, Andy, cowboy Andy, and immediately accuses Spike of being the Teddy Bomber. And in the confusion there, the actual Teddy Bomber gets away. Spike is infuriated. He gets run over by the horse. And what we are meant to notice is that despite being very silly with all the actual, cowboy trappings, just the animation, the visual design of Andy is very similar to Spike. Their face shape is almost identical. And they have kind of a similar demeanor too, although Andy is certainly sillier, especially on the basis that he is so wrong about Spike being the Teddy Bomber that it causes that, the bomber to escape. They never address it in the episode, but there's certainly signs that might suggest that Andy is kind of face blind. He really doesn't remember people's faces or can't really tell people apart by their face. Maybe that's part of what's going on there. but it's not important really why he's so inept in that regard. But it's interesting because I wonder if, from a writing perspective, if they needed to give him something like that, because well, they needed him to seem kind of dumb at first, at least, because we have to briefly at least be on Spike's side for why this guy is a menace. He's just a lunatic. So we cut back to the Bebop. Spike is explaining the crazy story that he just went through. And as just some good show don't tell storytelling, we have everyone else playing around with various like fancy dresses, and Ein is walking around with a wig on his head, and so we're like, what's going on with that? And we later find out because they're going to a masquerade ball as their next attempt to track this guy down, which is kind of fun. Just a nice little detail there. But Faye and Jet just think this story is too crazy. On a horse and everything? No, that seems crazy. And Spike's insisting. But at the point of, getting to the masquerade ball, where we have Faye dressed up in just sort of fancy dress with the mask. Jet is in like a hippie outfit. Spike just wearing a mask. And they're, again, going to try to capture the bomber. And just as, let's see. And so they're moving in on the teddy bomber, who is now literally dressed in a giant teddy bear outfit, which is great. They're about to capture him, and we get the second instance of a running gag where the bomber is trying to explain his whole philosophy as for why he's trying to blow these things up. But just before he can, he's interrupted again because Andy has shown up once again, accompanied by his soundtrack, riding his horse out of the elevator. It's all very silly. Jet and Faye are kind of dumbfounded that it was real. And so Faye actually chases after Andy, manages to get on the back of his horse with him by kind of being flirty. In the meantime, Jet ends up sort of stuck behind trying to manage all of the people running away from the bombs. And, and Spike gets separated from Andy, so he goes to get his ship to chase after. One thing to note is this episode was actually pulled from the regular air rotation after 9/11, and watching it now, it's easy to see why, because that first skyscraper attack in particular, it's two great big twin towers that are damaged by a terrorist explosion. So, I mean, the episode was made in 1999 before 9/11, so it's not like it was it was not an intentional coincidence. It's just a coincidence, but yeah, we could see why, at least for a while, people would have been really sensitive to that. But in any event, what we end up with is we have Spike and Andy ending up so focused on each other that they're pursuing each other kind of throughout the city, causing a lot of damage. As Spike's trying to chase the bomber, but then because Andy shoots at him and his ship, he ends up dealing with that. Meanwhile, we watch as the teddy bomber crashes his car, is so sure Andy's going to catch up with him, but Andy's now so distracted by Spike that he just rides right by. So, once again, teddy bomber escapes, Andy and Spike furious with each other. So, Faye this time has managed to sort of see Andy in a different light, manages at first at least to say, well, he is pretty handsome. He does he's not, he's certainly eccentric, but he's got something to him. But then he brings her back to his little boat, and it's just a total, she comments on the terrible lack of taste, and he feeds her his branded stew. son of a gun stew, which she says is terrible, and or she makes a face when she tries some, and it turns out that he's actually just like a rich trust fund kid who became a bounty hunter just because he thinks it's cool, and he demonstrates how stubborn he is. And it's basically a whole scene where she is just really commenting on, yeah, this is all very familiar. You are someone who could be doing other things, does this, but then when he gets his mind set on something, you cannot talk him out of it. And she specifically comments on how that seems very familiar. In the meantime, we have we also get Ed helping Jet and Spike. Excuse me. So I guess they did all together before the masquerade party identify who he was, and they, Spike, cheers that they discover that he was kicked out of the Young Men's Cowboy Association for being a nuisance to others, which is kind of hilarious and feels right, feels apt. Like, yeah, that sounds right. But in the meantime, we have Faye ends up coming back with having. It's unclear if she stole a bunch of the stew or if she how she got it exactly, but she has a whole case of the stuff. Since they were out of food, it's kind of funny that we would have Spike in that position of like having to eat the stew from his most hated enemy. Oh, buddy. Rocket is a silly dog. He's. What are you doing, buddy? What are you doing back there, huh? Huh? Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, so, where was I? Anyway, we have one last instance with the Teddy Bomber. Ed figures out where his next target's going to be. And then we have... sorry, I'm distracted by my own puppy cam. Hello, Rocket. Are you a good boy? Yeah, he's a good puppy. Where was I? Yeah, so it's the last, it's the final showdown. It's clear at this point that the Teddy Bomber, infuriated at being ignored when Spike and Andy focus on each other, that he has set up a trap for them, and it's demonstrated that they both end up falling prey to the trap because they both. So essentially, he set up, a trap in the elevator, and knew that they would know the elevator emergency access code, and so he changed it. And then Spike reveals, is like, haha, but I came in this morning and reverted it. And then Andy's like, but I inverted it, reverted it. And so that means it's actually back to what the the Teddy Bomber said it to, which means that, they fall into the trap because they both did the same thing. And it's just demonstrating over and over again how similar they are. They are struggling so much getting out of the elevator. They easily could have gotten out of the top access panel, first one, then the other. But because they both try to go at the same time, they're stuck in there until the explosion goes off. And then, there's a humiliation for Spike because they're saved by Andy's lasso, but then they have to climb to the top of the building and have a final showdown. It's all very silly. And we actually have Jet and Faye, having caught the Teddy Bomber, looking up at them and just like, those two, they're so similar. And at that point, actually, leaving Spike and Andy to have their showdown, which is, done in classic, like, apocalyptic Western style. They have their shootout, then they have a fight. They're so evenly matched. And then eventually what happens is that Spike sort of falls backwards off a ledge onto the next floor down of this ruined top of the skyscraper. And Andy is like, oh, well, I guess I win. But then Spike punches a desk out of frustration, and it causes a ripple effect that makes the ledge Andy's standing on fall off. Almost falls himself. But then we get Andy doing the bigger man, like, oh, well, that was a hell of a punch. I see now you're the better cowboy, and so I'll resign the job. And he hands off the hat, and Spike is just... And so we don't end up having Spike actually learn anything, really. But we end the episode with some fun stuff of the bomber finally gets to explain to the transport policeman that, his whole philosophy, it's basically Unabomber stuff. It's like the tall buildings are symbols of excessive capitalism, which, these days, you can get the motivating feeling, at least, if not the support them. Certainly not support actually blowing stuff up and killing people. That's not okay. But in any event, he gets to explain some of that. But then we hear Andy outside the police wagon, who's now dressed as a samurai instead of a cowboy. And that's the end of the episode. So it's not a heavy one. It's not a weighty one. It doesn't move the overall plot forward, but it does just kind of lampoon some of Spike's foibles in a way that I find entertaining, and it's got some fun, silly action in it, and, Teddy Bomber dressed as a teddy bear is fun, and the gag of him continuing to get interrupted while he's trying to explain his whole thing is good stuff. I like it. So next week we will continue. We're in the home stretch of episodes, but we will be watching session 23, Brain Scratch. And so in the meantime, I'll talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.